Hello everyone, this is John McCormick. I'm the Director of E-Learning Design. I work within ELIS, or E-Learning Instructional Support. This is the second video in the three-part series on blended teaching and learning strategies for 8-week face-to-face courses. This series of videos was based on an original face-to-face event held for Bunker Hill Community College instructors teaching 8-week face-to-face courses that meet once a week. So this was the agenda for the entire series, and we're on the blended learning models in part 2. So we're going to be talking about these models, or strategies in some cases we might call them, starting with the flipped classroom, and then blended learning going a little broader, and then going into a detailed strategy called just-in-time teaching that you should be able to use fairly quickly if you're teaching in this model. So blended learning would be the overarching umbrella concept here, and the flipped classroom is a model or strategy within blended learning. It's a blended learning strategy or model, and just-in-time teaching is definitely a sort of a detailed and specific blended learning strategy. We'll talk about that in detail now and in the next video. So first we want to look at the flipped classroom model, because that one is familiar to lots of people. It's based on the idea that the traditional classroom might be based on lecture, and then the homework activities are sort of the applied activities that students do at home. This is not, of course, what people do in lots of classrooms, especially at Lesley, but this is kind of where the idea of flip comes, and flipping that is basically, quote, putting the lecture online, and then the homework activities would become the classroom activities. So the applied activities would happen in the classroom, the more difficult things. I think where this becomes problematic is in the conception of what putting the classroom online means. So we're going to look at this video here, Flipped Classroom Explained. It's a 50-second video that explains this pretty well, and then we're going to move on beyond this. What becomes problematic is in the conception of what putting the classroom online means. So we're going to look at this video here, Flipped Classroom Explained. It's a 50-second video that explains this pretty well, and then we're going to move on beyond this.
Every course that has some face-to-face component progresses through a sequence of in-class time and out-of-class time. In a traditional lecture-based class, students are typically assigned material to study before coming to class, but then are expected to sit through a presentation that often covers similar content, and then assigned something to do for homework, usually on their own. In a flipped class, students have access to the instructor's lectures ahead of time, along with any other background material that they need, which frees up face-to-face time to let students seek clarification from instructors, collaborate with peers, and practice applying concepts while getting guidance and feedback directly from experts in the moment when it can help them most. This lets students leave class with an even greater collection of resources and a clearer awareness of what they need to focus on to close any gaps that remain in their learning. For more information on the flipped classroom and other teaching and learning resources, go to ctl.utexas.edu.
So that conception of the flipped classroom is a little bit constraining when we're talking about what happens with the lecture, but it's a good basis in which to start talking about blended learning. So I just wanted to stop and say a few thoughts on lectures, because a lecture is something that has been criticized a lot of late, but does have a purpose. What is the purpose of a lecture is my question to you to think about now, and what are the challenges of lectures? I'd say one of the key purposes of lectures is to convey information. It's a lot more than that, and lectures can be more active than traditionally are conceived of. But it's a traditional lecture delivers information in some ways, as do these other things, and they can be considered a resource for learning in that way. Some suggestions in general is to know students' prior knowledge before you lecture, and I'm going to talk about a way to do that using the online environment. Limit the length of lectures, what we know about the attention of people and students, and how long they're able to attend at one time. And in that regard, break into pieces or intersperse with what we might call active or constructive learning, and we'll define that a little bit later. And finally, consider moving what we might call a lecture online, or pieces of it, but do it in a certain intentional and careful way. So just to define active learning, it's a broad umbrella term for a large variety of teaching techniques. Some of them are listed below, along with case studies, role-playing, just-in-time teaching, which we'll talk about, peer teaching. The common element in active learning is for learners to do something that forces them to think about or engage with material, and that way construct meaning. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like too. With the rationale that active learning leads to better retention of information, knowledge. Going to the term blended learning, the thoughtful fusion of face-to-face and online learning experiences. This is Garrison and Vaughn. I've been looking at this for a long time, 15 years now. This is from the most recent iteration of a book that they had written. A couple of maybe rules of thumb or heuristics in thinking about blended in a general sense. If we think about face-to-face time as a bridge to the online time, that's one way to conceive of it. You could start, for example, an activity in the face-to-face environment and continue online. You could start a learning activity online and continue face-to-face, or in what we might call a traditional blended course. You could go from face-to-face to online, back to face-to-face, and so forth. This is a graphic I stole from the University of North Texas Health Center for Learning and Development that some people find useful. This is looking at the before the face-to-face, during the face-to-face, and after the face-to-face time, and looking at certain types of learning and teaching activities that might fit better into those time periods or those environments. So you can see in the face-to-face period there in the middle that challenging things are happening, things that require interaction or application type activities. Any of these activities could happen in either environment, face-to-face or online, but they might better fit into the ones listed here. That's another kind of heuristic. Then in general, using the online environment, thinking about it in these ways, you could supplement face-to-face learning. You could think of it that way. You could increase communication of the online environment using the different tools I've listed here. Talk a little bit more about tools in this third video to give feedback, and I'd say most impactfully to blend learning across both environments with the idea of increasing the efficiency of the face-to-face time. So we're talking about using the online environment. One of the main issues is to increase the efficiency of the face-to-face time. A few quick examples of blending learning activities. A blended discussion, you could start online and continue in the classroom, or reverse that order. There is some research showing that students who are reticent in a face-to-face discussion are less so when the discussion starts online. Online journals, a tool that is a private student to instructor communication tool. You can use that to discover gaps in knowledge, for reflections, other things. You could move the lecture online, as the flipped classroom sort of suggests. You could have mini lectures. Students could review these online. They could perform some activity online, one of those listed perhaps, and the instructor could use that student work to design the next face-to-face class, and the just-in-time model gets into detail around that. Another example that I like to use, because student presentations can take so much classroom time, is you could have this be blended by having students present asynchronously online. There are tools we have. VoiceThread is one of them, where students could work together to create a presentation or an individual presentation. Their classmates could then post questions in the online environment. And in the next face-to-face class, the presenters, those online presenters, could answer those questions, be prepared to answer those questions live, and then do additional Q&A. So this is one example of a way this could work, but it could save significant classroom time, maybe make that classroom time more efficient. This all, of course, how you do this sort of thing, or if you do it, depends on the goals of the classroom and what kind of presentation skills, if that is something you're focusing on.